The movie begins with a little boy moving towards an abandoned house to fetch his ball. Having fear in his heart, he ascends the steps. Just then, the door of the house opens on its own. The little boy crawls to the ball and recovers it too, but soon, he is swallowed by the house, and afterward, the door shuts on its own. Now, the scene shifts to a TV host named Quentin, appearing on a scary show called Sinister Sights. Quentin states the dark history of the Wicker house in which countless people lost their lives. Quentin reveals that the people living in the vicinity of the Wicker house have heard dreadful noises emanating from the house. The next day, a group of people from the Sinister Sights show arrives in a van outside the Wicker house to shoot a video from inside the house. Heather, a paranormal researcher, gets off the van and takes a look at the house and finds the house painted. She tells Simon that she can feel a lot of energy from the house. Besides Simon and Heather, Tom and Bob are also in this team. Tom asks Simon, who painted the house. Simon answers, "I don't have any idea about it." Actually, the TV ratings of the Sinister Sights shows are declining, causing the show to die little by little. That's why, the producers of the show have sent this team to the Wicker house to revive the show. Upon entering the house, Heather comes across a voodoo doll, lying on the ground. Just as she picks up the doll, she starts experiencing the flashbacks of the tormented people. On the other side, Tom also stumbles upon some creepy stuff, hanging from the tree. Moments later, Greg and Tom enter the house and find everything perfectly in its place, as if someone had been expecting them. They find fresh edible things in the refrigerator, whereas the house has been derelict for ages. This catches both of the men off guard. Shortly after, a bank realtor named Sarah arrives. She asks Simon how they unlocked the gate without a key. He responds it was already unlocked. She warns Simon that he and his team are not allowed to stay at the house at night. You are only permitted to film here during the daytime. Meanwhile, Tom arrives and tries to bring Sarah around, but she is too stubborn to let them stay at night for filming the video. Tom and Sarah get into a verbal altercation, but Greg intervenes and takes her away to pacify the matter. Inside the house, Bob takes out a fresh apple from the fridge, despite the warning from Simon. Soon after, he finds the apple filled with worms, causing him to drop it in fear. Heather is still exploring the house. Simon, who acts as a cinematographer in this team, begins to do his job. Tom makes his way into a room taking a ghost detector machine. Shortly after, he finds strong readings in the meter, indicating the presence of an invisible force in the room. Tom stares at the chair. He approaches it, just then a black misty entity passes by him. Heather comes into the room and reveals that there is so much pain surrounding them. Tom leaves the room. Heather moves to the chair and begins to have flashbacks of people getting persecuted. Bob mounts a camera on the wall, but suddenly, a squirt of blood splashes onto his face, catching his attention. All of a sudden, an invisible force shuts the door, causing him to hurt his fingers and leaving a hole in the wall. Greg comes into the room and asks Bob to take care of his wound. Bob leaves the room and Greg approaches the hole, and finds a thick liquid like saliva dripping. Outside, Bob encounters a young woman in the corridor. He begins to go after her, and afterward, he finds her in the shower. He approaches her, and as soon as he pulls back the curtain, there is nothing but bugs everywhere in the bathtub. He quickly gets away from there and begins to call his fellows. Suddenly, his foot is stuck in the floorboard, and soon after, he is dragged under the floorboard. In the room, Greg peeps into the hole, and afterward, puts his hand into it to retrieve the camera. He gropes around, and comes upon the camera, covered in saliva. Upon seeing this, Greg becomes confused. He goes straight to Tom and explains that there is something wrong in this house. I have found the camera, covered in ectoplasm behind the wall. However, Tom doesn't take it seriously, and laughs it off. Heather knocks about the garden of the house. Moments later, a shadowy entity heads towards her, but as soon as she turns around, she finds no one. Greg and Simon set up the whole system required for filming a video. Simon calls Bob but he doesn't respond. Moments later, Greg, Simon and Tom see the CCTV footage and find Bob disappearing in the corridor. They send a robotic toy to locate Bob, while Tom records all this and informs the viewers that very strange things have started happening with them since their arrival in the Wicker house. Such as soon as they entered the house, they found a refrigerator full of fresh food, indicating there might be a presence here that was expecting us. While heading upstairs, Greg's meter starts receiving strong reading. Meanwhile, in the CCTV camera, Simon and Greg spot a severed foot near the door, but meanwhile, blood starts coming from Heather's mouth, drawing everyone's attention. Heather reveals that there lives a malevolent entity in this house. Therefore, we should leave this house right now. Just then, they all hear Bub upstairs screaming for help. Tom and Greg head upstairs while continuously recording the video. Shortly after, they reach the severed foot. Greg tries to detach it from the door, but finds it totally disgusting. Bub screams for help again, catching Greg and Tom's attention. Greg notices that Bub's voice is coming from the attic. Hence, he pulls back the door, letting the step ladder come down. Greg goes up and starts filming. He discovers a cleaver covered in fresh blood, which startles Greg. Down there, Simon enters a room from where a disturbing audio is emanating. Simon makes an effort to decode the audio file. He asks Tom to listen to the audio. They all notice that someone is crying and continuously saying "let me go," while they hear the torturer saying, "if you open the door, I will come in." Simon shows the video footage to Greg in which Bub disappears after covering some distance. They discover some fireflies hovering around Bub before he went missing. Shortly after, they spot a shadowy figure heading toward Bub. All of a sudden, Heather begins to choke on a tuft of hair, emerging from her mouth, while Tom and Simon record it, but Greg seems to be concerned about it. Therefore, he gets her a glass of water to calm her down. She reveals that something in this house got inside of her. Greg tells her to leave the house, but Heather is not ready to do it, and says, "Nobody can help but me." Elsewhere, Tom does his level best to decode the audio and hears someone saying, "if any man opens the door, I will come in for him." Simon contacts the police to get help, but the cop on the other side can't hear Simon properly. Suddenly, he hears Sarah, the bank realtor, asking him for help. Shortly after, a video footage starts playing on the computer, featuring Tom in a possessed state and killing other members of the team. Outside, a cop comes to the Wicker house after receiving an emergency call from Simon. The cop contacts other cops, but his wireless phone begins to act up. He tries to open the door, but it is locked from inside. So, he climbs the gate to get over it, but gets killed by the pointy bars of the gate. It gets dark outside, and the corpse of the cop is dragged into a pit by an invisible force, and afterward, the cop's car is also backed up. Shortly after, Sarah arrives. The door opens itself to let her in. She storms into the room, causing Tom to ask her why she came over there. She tells him that Heather called her. On this, Greg says that Heather doesn't have her number. After that, Simon reveals that he called the police, not Sarah. When all were trying to unravel the mystery, they hear noise coming from upstairs, causing everyone to rush upstairs. In the room, Heather breaks down the wall by using a metallic rod. She jitteringly peeps into the wall, but is freaked out by the sudden appearance of Bub. He asks Heather for help, but soon afterward, someone pulls him back forcefully, while everyone can do nothing but watch it. Sarah begins to suffocate in the room. So, she approaches the window to get some fresh air. Suddenly, the window pane shatters, but Greg saves Sarah in time. Unfortunately, a shard of glass finds its way into her mouth. Simon pulls out the shard, and his effort to save her leads Sarah to her death. Everyone is shaken by this incident. Therefore, Simon runs to the main door to escape the jinxed house. Nonetheless, he finds the door locked from the other side. He smashes the window glass with a box, but the window pane miraculously repairs itself, indicating the house is preventing anyone from escaping. In the room, Tom notices that Sarah's blood starts drying and the door starts repairing itself. Greg reveals that this house is haunted by a lot of spirits, and it seems like the house itself is alive. Tom leads his team to the staircase, where he shows the portraits of previous owners of the Wicker house. Tom tells about Desmond Delacroix, one of the owners of the Wicker house. Tom says that Desmond Delacroix passed away in 1760 at the age of 37 on Wicker Lane. It is said that he was obsessed with eternal life, and he used his slaves to fulfill this obsession in the dark arts. However, he died, but his soul is still in this house. Thereafter, Tom leads others to a room and opens a book containing the history of the house. As per the records, Tom reveals that Delacroix made his slaves bury the bodies of their dead relatives in the foundation of the house and the walls. Simon begins smashing the nearby door. From the cabinet, Tom discovers a bone. Outside, Quentin makes his way to the Wicker house. Inside the house, Greg comes into the attic and finds many invisible things floating around as well as some humanoids. In the other room, Tom is hypnotized by a commercial advertisement featuring Sarah. Greg discovers images of humans bound to the log on his camera, but in reality, no one is physically present, causing Greg to shake in his shoes. Shortly afterward, the fallen masters of the Wicker house appear physically. The entrance of the attic also gets blocked. Down there, Tom is still in a possessed state. Heather turns on the monitor and finds herself on the screen, causing her to get bewildered. Soon after, the evil entity scares her away. In the attic, one of the human images comes to life and begins to sneak upon Greg, who is utterly terrified at this moment. The giant entity keeps on moving towards Greg, causing him to fire at the fallen man. Upon hearing the gunshot, Tom gets out of the possession. Elsewhere in the house, Simon is attacked by his robot, but shortly after, he destroys the possessed robot. On the other side, Greg keeps firing at the fallen man, but the man is immune to the firearms. Hence, the freaked-out Greg breaks the window and jumps out of it, but reaches another room. The door opens on its own for Quentin, but he shrugs it off and comes in. He knocks on the door and asks Tom to let him in, but Tom doesn't open the door, and keeps him standing outside the door. Greg comes and explains to Quentin that this house is like a cave. He asks Quentin to check the shack situated outside. Therefore, he gets to the shack and finds it locked. So, he peers through an opening and discovers a well inside the shack. Quentin informs Greg and others that there is a well inside this shack. Afterward, Greg asks Quentin to find a key to slave quarters under the tree. Quentin goes and begins to look for the key among other spooky stuff hanging from the tree. Some of the twigs start preventing Quentin from getting a hold of the key. However, he manages to grab the key, but soon after, a twig comes flying and plunges into his body. Tom arrives there and snatches the key, and shortly after, Quentin dies. Tom takes the key and comes into the ominous house, and sits on the chair near the fireplace. He chucks his driving license into the fireplace, while Greg is seeing all this. Simon and Heather carry Sarah's body to the shack. Simon unlocks the door and takes Sarah's body into the sack with Heather. Moments later, Simon and Heather throw Sarah's dead body into the starving well, in order to save themselves. This well is the stomach of the house, and no one can escape it, unless he feeds it a human body. Afterward, the door of the shack closes itself. Heather tries to unlock it. In the meantime, a misty entity emerges from the well behind Simon, and takes him into the well, while Heather runs to help him. In the house, Greg finds Bub behind the wall in worse condition. He takes him out of the drain. In the shack, a demon emerges from the well and tries to carry Heather into the well, but in the nick of time, Greg comes and takes her away, saving her. He asks her to go to the van, and he leaves to take Bub and Tom himself. Tom kills Heather on her way to the van, meaning he has been possessed by the house. Later, he stabs her with an iron bar, killing her, and afterward, he kills Bub. Greg comes out of the house and looks for Bub and Heather. Just then, the possessed Tom, holding a cleaver, shows up and asks Greg where he is going. Greg tries to bring him back to his senses, but nothing happens. So, he starts fleeing, but Tom stabs him in the back with the cleaver, causing Greg to die. Years later, a couple comes to spend the night at the House of Bones. Upon entering the house, they find Tom sitting on the chair, as he is the new owner of this house, and with this horrific ending, this movie comes to an end.